welcome to All Ears.
So all the people who signed up and who showed up here this evening, thank you so much. I'm sure you already know who we have today. Molly Webster is a senior correspondent at Radiolab. It's an award-winning radio show and podcast, which has been on air for about 20 years now. And I'm sure most of you are already familiar with Molly's work. Molly has investigated everything from surrogacy to sex chromosomes to looking at the future of sort of like looking into how she's reported a lot throughout the pandemic, trying to help us make sense of what's really happening and what to sort of expect and those kind of things. But yeah, I'm so grateful that Molly agreed to be part of this. We were so excited when she said yes, and like everybody who sort of like signed up, I feel like we could feel the excitement in all the retweets and all the replies that we got on Twitter. So we're very thankful for that. And I know Molly through a episode that we worked on together several years ago, which feels like I don't know how long ago. It was 2015. So hi Molly, we're so excited to have you.
Hi.
Hi.
What a great, I'm blushing. What a great introduction. Thank you. It's so fun to be a part of everything.
Yeah. I just wanted to, I don't know if I've told this to you, Molly, but when I was approached by someone who was in touch with someone at Radiolab and you guys were looking for a reporter here in Nepal, I'd never heard of Radiolab. They said it's like a really cool show that, they want a reporter. And I was like, okay, fine. So I looked up Radiolab and I thought the name was very, very clever. I was like, oh, that's quite clever name, like a science lab, Radiolab. I was like, nice. And then when I heard the final product, because I remember I had no idea how Radiolab worked on these stories. It was my first time. Molly guided me to how to switch on the recorder and sort of the sound levels and everything.
Oh my God.
And then
that's right.
Yeah, and
I totally forgot that.
Yeah, and we will talk about this. And we went on talking, and Molly had all these questions, and I was like, we were talking for like hours, and then suddenly the episode is out, and I just could not believe the way it all fit together and it sounded. And I think since then I've just sort of like always wanted to do the kind of stories that Radiolab does. And one of the reasons why we also want to do this festival and talk to speakers like you is to also expand our understanding of the possibilities that audio media provides, right? But before we get to that, I think we've already spoken about Radiolab, and I'm sure all of us here already have a favorite episode. What's yours, Molly?
Wow, that is a hard question. I mean, one of the ones I talk about all the time that made me actually want to work at the show is this episode called Guts. And it's about different takes. It's like a whole bunch of stories that are all about different takes on your gut, on your stomach. And I just remember this like one scene where they were talking about like how cows digest things. And the reporter, who's a good friend of mine, this guy, Tim Howard, who now works in podcasting from Berlin, but he like stuck his hand into a cow to feel it like digest. And I remember like it was the grossest but most joyful thing that I had heard. I went into journalism because I wanted to report about science, but I've always had a really, really broad view of what science is. Like I grew up in a very rural part of America where it was like all dairy cow farms and cornfields. And my experience with science was just like being out in the world every day, so like looking at tadpoles in my pond or I don't know, like looking at animal tracks in the snow or something. And it sounds very romantic, and maybe at some level it was, but like to me, and then people started telling me that this like way that I experienced the world was like science, and that was like special or something. And while I think that science is really siloed, like my interest is to say like, no, science is like waking up in the morning and falling asleep at night, and like all of the things that happen in between, us talking. I don't really go like there's science, there's technology, there's math, and those are all different. It's like, no, it's just the world we live in. When I heard this episode where this guy stuck his hand in this cow and like felt the digestion happen, like the scrunching happen around his hand. It was like nighttime and I was listening to a podcast and I was just like, this is so fun. Like, this is the world. Like, they're capturing the world. And it doesn't feel like academic, capital S, science. And so that was really, I was just like listening to so much, as many episodes as I could at that point. And I don't know how long ago that was, ages ago. And because I first got introduced to the show probably 17 years ago on a CD-ROM that one of my friends played in a car in Cleveland, Ohio. and then I moved to New York and ended up meeting Jad, who is the founder of the show and has recently retired. And yeah, so I guess, and then I feel like maybe we haven't actually described the show for people who haven't heard it. And I'm sort of, I'm not sure I'm the greatest at doing that. So you guys can like boost it up after I do sort of like a deflated explanation, but it's basically like an audio documentary. So it's like a documentary for your ears with a lot of sound design, meaning there's like not just like sound effects, but like music composition and just like ways of communicating feelings and emotions that aren't just through words, but through like atmosphere. And we tend to do a lot of science stories, and we do many, many interviews generally for each of our episodes, and then like cut those interviews together with kind of like the atmosphere of music and sound, and then create episodes that are anywhere from 15 minutes to, when we're really proud of ourselves, like an hour and 20 minutes.
Just to talk about some of the recent works that you've done, and Radiolab has done such a fantastic work in the last 2 years. It's been so difficult the last 2 years for everyone, and especially I think like a podcast like Radiolab, which has already explained such difficult, nuanced, complex issues, in the past, many of it relating to science, to be able to take on, to explain, better inform the listeners about what was happening as the pandemic unfolded. And for you as a reporter, I was talking to Molly about how I found the COVID crystal ball episode so, I think I don't know, assuring in some ways, that I sort of felt.
Oh, it assured you. That's great.
Yeah, as in like not assured me as in like it's going to be safe, but there was so much uncertainty around, just to know that certain things about the way the virus works, or what is happening to like to people who might be already experiencing it before we learn about it through with this new case or something like that. So I just wanted to know about your experience, reporting about the pandemic as it unfolded, especially when there was so much misinformation swirling around. What was it like for you as a reporter? Especially, I think you were based in New York, and that was sort of the epicenter of the first wave when it started happening.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Wow. I feel like I'm just starting to look back, like we're all just being able to take a breath maybe for real for the first time, at least in New York. For me, the pandemic was a really interesting moment just as a journalist, because in the last few years at Radiolab, I've tended to do a lot of medical body, human stories. I've been reporting a lot about immunity or autoimmune diseases or biological sex development, just like the ways humans interact with their bodies. And so suddenly there was this like big pandemic that was really directly affecting that. So in a weird way, it felt like it was like a sweet spot of like interests for me. At the same time, I was also really terrified, I think, as we all were. And so reporting on it became a chance to, like, I could not stop consuming information about it. And I wanted that information to be straight from scientific sources. So I think the way that I moved through trying to understand it and misinformation just as a human before I was a journalist was just, I guess with journalism training and my background is biology, having some comfort with accessing and reading scientific articles. And so I felt like very early on, I was going straight to sources that were like thinking about it and studying it, whether that was scientists or public health experts that have dealt with epidemics before they're pandemics. And so that sort of naturally, just as a human, that was the stuff I was reading. And then it just really works with my job because it was like, okay, what are you seeing in all of these early articles? And I could just call people up on the phone and it was like, what are they saying? So it's interesting because, so I think that's how I work through a lot of misinformation. And honestly, it was a time when there wasn't necessarily like, especially the first 6 months, there wasn't necessarily like misinformation. It was just like every other day we were learning something new. And so stuff was changing. And I just found that really fascinating because it fully was like, I think to people on the outside of like reading science every day felt like, why do scientists keep changing their mind? But to me, I was like, oh, this is science. We're just actually getting to witness it in real time because this is a major life-threatening emergency. And they're just like learning more every day. And so I don't know, it just became like, honestly, a very exciting time as well as a very scary time. And I actually left New York and moved in with like my best friend back in Ohio and my nephew, because they had a spare room and I just didn't want to be like isolated in New York. And that actually came from reading very early things that said, you know, as things started to descend here in February, a lot of early reports were saying from health experts were saying this was going to last through September. And so I was like, oh, there's no way I'm going to make it in an apartment in New York without, you know, none of my family lives in the city. So I was like, I have to get out. And then so I just made so many of these stories from a closet in Ohio, like asking my nephew to like run around outside so I could do the recordings. And it was really, yeah, I don't know. It was like really amazing. And I'm super proud of the work we did. And if I think about some of the stories that came out of it, they were, you know, they were stories like I was just like calling people and having conversations, and then someone would be like, you know, I saw like doctors and ER doctors and scientists and people making drugs, and they would offhand say like, oh, I saw this article about blood plasma transfer and like how that could help, you know, and I'd be like, oh, what's that? And I'd go, and I felt like it gave us like an interesting leg up. And one of the interesting questions we've had since kind of COVID, I mean, Radiolab is not a news show in any way, but it's like, how do you keep that momentum? Yeah. Because it like let us put out stories really quickly, and we tend to be really slow in putting out stories. And so was like, how do we grab that kind of same momentum? Can you grab that same momentum when there's not an emergency happening? And like still do stories that are like occasionally newsy or occasionally tangential to the news, or are our own take on the news, like essayistic features, or have nothing to do with the news but are fast. And I don't know if we've figured that out yet, but I think we're all like still recovering. So who knows?
Yeah. I mean, we also like increased our production massively during the pandemic. We produced like more episodes than we had ever done before. But yeah, no, that was going to be my next question. Like this, you know, when everything was unfolding so quickly, and as a podcast which sort of integrates science to like human sort of daily life, you know, didn't you have this urge to kind of, I don't know, like every day, like update your audience or your listeners, and is that even possible? And how big is your team? How do you like work together on production?
It was interesting. I mean, like we did end up becoming a weekly show during the pandemic, which is not, we usually produce new episodes or publish new episodes like bi-weekly, and that's not hard and fast, and we've ebbed and flowed from that schedule. But during the pandemic, we were for sure weekly, at least during the first like 8 months, we were for sure weekly. And sometimes we released 2 episodes a week, which was interesting. I mean, I think the thing you're really weighing at that point is like team. How is the team doing? Burnout. Yeah. Like everybody's dealing with so much stuff emotionally and individually. It's a situation none of us have been in our lives before, like as a global community. And so I think in those first 6 months, it was like whoever could be present was present, you know, like whoever was present to do episodes was present. And in a large way, I was one of those people and it was just how I needed to process the world. Sometimes I think journalism is really voyeuristic, where I go out and report on things or interact with things that I want to see because it will help me somehow be a better human in the world, or like it will help me very selfishly process something that I'm dealing with, you know? And so it was just like I was dealing with this pandemic and I wanted to read about it and I wanted to understand and I wanted to be able to tell people about it. And wonderfully, beautifully, like Radiolab was like right there. And so there's like, I don't know, the Radiolab staff is about, I don't know, roughly 20 people. And, you know, there were editors, Pat Walters, Soren Wheeler, that just stayed up with Jad and I all night while we were trying to finish stuff. Like I remember there's one episode where it's about this blood plasma donation. And so taking someone who's had COVID, taking their blood plasma, giving it to someone who's sick with COVID, and then hopefully the antibodies in the first person's blood plasma will help the second person. And for that episode, we talked to this scientist who was pushing clinical trials of blood plasma in the US. And I happened to be working with him on another story. And then I was like, whoa. So I was able to just call him really quick. He was like leading the charge. I was able to just call him on my cell phone, record a conversation, and get that tape very fast. Like he and I were already in touch a bunch. That was very happenstance. But it's like, it speaks to how like a body of work can help. Like as you start gaining contacts in a body of work, it will help you. And then my editor, Pat, found this tweet on Twitter, which I'm not on social media. So he found this tweet on Twitter and it was like a woman, Tatiana, a doctor, very high profile in the business now, who was trying to find a blood plasma donor for her, one of her relatives. And so Tatiana and I got on the phone, but like we got on the phone one night at like 10 p.m. my time. And I remember just sort of like going into this closet, because I go into a closet because it's really quiet to record in there, because there's the stuffing of your clothes and your pillows and like whatever's in that closet. And I just kind of hang a mic from anything I can hang a mic from. And then I put a little chair in and I have like a little magnetic light that I can put on things and then turn on. And so I went into this little closet. And I sort of just remember falling out of the closet like 2.5 hours later at almost like 1 a.m, just like exhausted, but like so stimulated. And then I remember seeing my friend and just I don't know what just happened, but like, I think it was an amazing, like I learned so much. And then I gave the tape to my editor and he just somehow like sliced through 2.5 hours of tape and like edited it down to this conversation, like within the day. And we kind of put the scientist who was talking from a historical perspective and from a present day urgency with this conversation. And it just was this really powerful episode that still makes me cry, because one of the things Tatiana talked about is just how COVID was just making everybody die alone. And that was like the real pandemic, was the isolation that everybody was going through. And it really, you know, that's interesting to me because that's not science, so to speak. I wouldn't have known that that's where the conversation was going to go, but she just got straight to the heart of what was happening in that moment in the pandemic. And it was just a beautiful episode and beautiful conversation. And I think really became, it was like there were people out there doing tons of news reporting, and that's not what we were doing. It was like, what is the heart of the matter? And we found it sometimes.
So Molly, we do want to make most of your time with us this evening. I think our audience or listeners who registered to this session, a lot of them are journalists as well, and we want to like touch a little bit on, because I remember watching one of your earlier interviews on YouTube, and you said, for you, like storytelling is like really important. And as Nepali podcasters, we're experimenting with different forms and formats. But I think we're not quite there yet when it comes to like using the audio medium for storytelling, whilst it's still, rigorous and so can you give us like, us Nepali podcasters and other podcasters perhaps as well who want to explore a similar template, like how should we go about it, and what would your like advice be?
That's a great question, because sometimes I forget that storytelling is not actually always linked to journalism, and they are two different things, and we combine it. So there's like journalism, which is going out, interviewing people, getting information, and then somehow digesting that and getting it out to the public, right? And you can do that through print, magazines, newspapers, podcasts, whatever. And so that's how I started. But in grad school, and maybe everybody knows this, but I didn't know this, I discovered this thing called like narrative nonfiction, which is essentially like you tell a longer journalism thing, which might involve multiple interviews and be a more complicated story, or it might just involve one person. But as part of doing that, when you bring those facts to the world, you tell a story while you're doing it. And I was just like, this is amazing. This is what I love, because it's not just facts. It's like humanity and the world, like in the middle. We all, and people love stories. Like I think now I know people love stories. I don't think I went into this going like people love stories, but a beginning, middle, and an end can be made out of just facts, but a beginning, middle, and end can also be made out of a character. There are characters that can give you a story. There are scenes, like if there's a fire and in a neighborhood, or a memory can give you a story. And so the type of journalism I do is like I'm looking for the stories within the facts, I guess. And so it's like, is a scientist I'm interviewing, do they have a discovery story? Like, did they, they're telling me about something specific. Like I just wrote this paper about XYZ, but is there anything like in getting to the process of writing that paper that was like, I was in the lab late one night and then I discovered blah, blah, and then we had this and then we all had champagne, and like, is there like a story? Even if it's super small, or like, if you're talking to a person, it's like, how did they get to the moment that is making you talk to them? And so I think just like a lot about that when I'm interviewing people, or if I'm if I'm fascinated by a time in like history, say, is there a narrative to construct around that besides just saying like it happened in 1848 and it was rainy that day and everybody was gathered in the square. Like, can you add things that like fill it out a little? And I just like this type of story. I just like this type of journalism because I don't know, I love humans, I think, and it just gets you, whether you're reporting on the law or economics or politics or, just your local neighborhood, people want to know more, like they just want to like connect, you know? And so storytelling as part of journalism lets you do that in an interesting way. I don't know if that answers your question at all, but
yeah.
Oh yeah,
No, yeah, it does. And in fact takes us to the other question that we wanted to ask. You did mention about how you got fascinated by audio storytelling, but you had mentioned that you started out wanting to be a science writer, science reporter. So for a lot of our reporters here, we, like Itisha said, we don't have a lot of reporters who've really experimented with sort of like the deep dive audio storytelling that podcasts like Radiolab does. So if you were to, you know, like maybe just share your own experience about what was different for you as a reporter, writing these stories about the things that you write versus making them for an audio medium, like the things that you maybe think about differently, do differently, you know?
Yeah. That's a very good question, because I think for a while I was like, wow, they're strikingly similar, which is great, because that's a great start, because it makes you not scared to like engage with audio. So I think the first thing is like they're strikingly similar. So if you can do one, you can begin the other. So take that with you and run. And then there are little things that you can start looking out for that actually start becoming major things. And so for the first one that comes to mind is what we call casting at Radiolab. And it sounds maybe a little gauche, but it's like you're putting someone's voice on the air, or you want it to be someone that's like super engaged with the thing that they're telling you about. So it's interesting, like if I think about science journalism, you know, there's probably hundreds of people in the world that could tell me about like RNA or DNA. But the best person for audio, and they're all probably equally qualified and could tell you the exact same thing and make it interesting in their own ways. But the person that's best for audio is the person that's gonna like bring something across with their voice. So they're gonna be excited, or they're gonna tell a story naturally, or they're gonna have fun during the interview. Not fun in like it's like hysterical way, but just like you can tell they're engaged in the interview and they like getting questions asked. So that's what you're excuse me, that's what you're thinking about with audio, is who like is like the people that you're choosing to interview will go on air. And so you want the listener to have like a relationship with them and to be engaged with the voice that they're hearing. And that is super accepting of like all accents and backgrounds and everything like that. It's just like thinking about, you know, what is that? Like, how does that person communicate through their voice, you know? I think the other thing is I think about writing, like if I'm writing a script, like shorter sentences work better. You know, I think from print, because you can also do the same narrative nonfiction in print, right? You can apply it to audio, you can apply it to print. And in print with narrative nonfiction, you'll see a lot of like long sentences and complicated sentences and many clauses and metaphors and all that type of stuff. In audio, the long sentences that are like complex and have many clauses like don't really work. Yeah. Because people start to like forget what the object is and what the noun was. And so you have to sort of, they're much more shorter sentences that are like lined up to lead you. You're like taking someone's hand and like, I'm going to lead you. Because in print, you can go back and reread. But in audio, no one really wants to rewind. So you really have to think about like, okay, I'm going to step this person through to get them from this part of the story to this part of the story and to make this part of the story land. The other thing with audio is you have like that atmospheric space to work with. So in print, if I'm going to say something like, you can use a metaphor to do that. But in audio, you're not solely reliant on the words, right? So if if I'm going to say something about the brain, and I want to say like the brain is like an electrical grid and everything is like firing, in print I have to say all those words. In audio, depending on how like complex you want to get, you can make sounds of things like pring, 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 and then you can use less words. So you can say it's like an electrical grid, and then you can hear pring, 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 pring. And maybe you don't need to say everything's firing, or maybe you still do, but you can like, just like beef up that section a little. Yeah. So those are the things I think about.
Molly, we were also really curious about like the Radiolab and sort of This American Life are kind of the holy grail of podcasts. And when you guys started off and where sort of the ecosystem of podcasts is in the US, especially, there's so many podcasts now.
There's so many.
Who's listening to them?
Yeah, who are these people?
There's like I just heard a stats, like there's over 3 million podcasts in the world. Wow. I don't even understand. Like, I don't even understand how that works. What?
But yeah, we were curious about how like these podcasts are sustaining themselves. Like, obviously there are the podcasts like, you know, where we kind of just do it in our own time, whatever, but these are actually like great like shows being produced with like high production values. And we're just curious, like, how is this sustainable?
Like, so how Radiolab sustains itself, or just like any podcast?
Well, I guess Radiolab, and then maybe other podcasts too. Yeah.
Well, so Radiolab is part of a public radio station. So kind of like America's BBC is like National Public Radio, but the National Public Radio, there are all these like local city affiliates. And so, New York City has, which is where Radiolab is based, but not our entire staff is based here. So, but we're associated with WNYC, also called New York Public Radio. And so they handle our distribution and monies. And so we're like a show of theirs that then they sell and release. And the public radio model here is you get funding from the government, you get funding from advertisers, and you get funding from people giving you money, like me giving public radio money. Listeners giving money, and then there are other things like for Radiolab, we have a lot of like foundational support: the Simons Foundation, the Templeton Foundation, the Sloan Foundation, the National Science Foundation. Like, you'll hear all those things in our. So the model that Radiolab is in this like all encompassing, where we use every facet of like raising money, of getting money. Then but I do think like parts of that can be used by people that are not, by podcasts or audio people that are not associated with like, say, a public radio station or a public radio company. Then there's like for-profit companies like, a Gimlet or which is now Spotify, an Audible kind of thing. And then that's like a completely different, you're one of their products basically. And then they get funding in different ways. And so basically an independent podcaster or audio maker can tap into any one of those things to try and find resources. And that sounds very rosy, but I do want to acknowledge that I understand that can be really hard, especially depending on where you're coming from. And so, but I think the kind of Patreon model, where people are saying like, hey, I have this newsletter, I have audio, I'll give you a button, for free, sign up for $5 a month or $2 a month. That has been showing to be like a pretty successful model that works for both. Like Radiolab is kind of experimenting and starting to use that now. So that works for both individuals who are like working out of their basements and larger companies. And then I also think like if you can get some sort of institutional support, whether that's like universities are also very often an interesting place where, if you can, they want to get in their own way into audio and have funds to do that. So like that's a place where you can get associated foundations who are looking for philanthropic like giving and donations. Like that's a good place to go. I think to get yourself to the bigger and bigger and bigger audience, it's probably best to get like attached to something, like whether that's a company, nonprofit or for-profit, or like a network, like the Radiotopia network, like in the US, like where you're part of a network of a bunch of different shows and they kind of all elevate each other. Yeah. And so, yeah, that's those are thoughts on models and sustainability. It's very, and I don't, like, I'm very lucky to work at a show that is attached to an institution. Yeah. And so, yeah, I just want to say that.
Yeah, I think we want to step back a little bit and go back to sort of like, I'm sure all the people joining us, they're big fans of Radiolab. And I had the opportunity when I was in New York, when Molly invited me to one of the meetings.
That was so fun. We went on a walk and had a coffee in the park.
Yes, we did. But then I actually met people, Robert, who was there at that time, in the meet. Yeah. And Latif Nasir on TV, on video. We were like doing some video call. Anyway, so would you explain, because the kind of stories that Radiolab does, it does not limit itself to one kind of storytelling, right? There's so many different issues, there's so many different themes, and now so many spin-offs that's come out from Radiolab, which are amazing. If you could explain to us, how does, before, like, I wouldn't count the time during the pandemic when you said that you'd almost gone into like this weekly mode, just trying to make sense of what was happening. But before the pandemic, or even when you do non-COVID stories now, how does it usually work, like from pitching to like actually when we listen to the final product?
That's a good question to explain that. So the show has like a team of producer reporters, me, Latif, who's now one of the co-hosts, Lulu Miller, who's one of the co-hosts, Simon Adler, Annie McEwen. So we have this like team of reporter producers, and we also have a team of contributing editors who are sort of out in the world doing things, aren't on staff at the show, but come to us either with ideas or to think about the ideas we're thinking about. With us. So, it can be a lawyer, a scientist, a magazine writer, that kind of, a doctor, that kind of thing. And so we have pitch meetings every other week. So we have a pitch meeting after I talked to you all this morning. We have a pitch meeting about an hour and a half later. And that is an hour and a half long meeting that happens every other week, where people on the show come with ideas, or people on the show bring ideas from outside producers and reporters, because we work with outside writers and reporters all the time. And so we bring ideas, we put them on this pitch doc. Everyone looks at the ideas and they think about, like, what are the characters here? What's the diversity here? What's the storytelling strengths? Like, is there any surprise? Is this from a community we don't normally hear from? Like, and we like kind of analyze the story from the pitch from all these different perspectives. And the team thinks about, like, if we were going to do this, how would we do it? And then from that like hour and a half long discussion, a team of like kind of senior staff will meet the following week and just be like, which ones do we want to try and move forward on? And which ones are we going to say no to or shelve, or say they need more before they can come back to being a pitch or something. And so the ones that get the okay, that's called green lighting. And then it is like the reporter, producer, the outside reporter, whatever, is given like some gentle instructions for like, yeah, we're into this, just start. Or yeah, we're into this, but we really want to hear more about that scene in the swamp. Like, so make sure you get that. Or yeah, this sounds interesting, but like, you just got to figure out if this main person will talk and is a good talker. So we just kind of get some like general instructions, or just like advice, or just total thumbs up, just run at it. And then the reporter will start making calls. And sometimes those calls are early, so they're not recorded. Oftentimes at this point, you just record it to see what happens. And then that's called gathering tape, and you're starting to get a sense of like what the story is and where it lives and who you need to talk to. And so that process goes on, and we have like weekly check-ins where we're just like, hey, what's going on with your story? And then we, update the editor that's assigned to the story, and sometimes, a lot of times, this part of the process is pretty solo. And then as you get deeper into the process and closer to publish, more people get added in. But in the beginning, it's really just the reporter trucking along, and then checking in with an editor, once a week or more if like something comes up. And so you're gathering tape, maybe you fly somewhere, maybe you drive somewhere and you record the sound of a river or something. And then you keep gathering tape. And then you get to a point where you're like, okay, I think I've at least understand like the shape of this. Maybe not done reporting entirely, but I think I have a general sense. And so you do something called a storyboard, which is like a 2 to 3 page outline essentially of what the story looks like. Kind of written, it's all written. It's one of our not all of our stuff is written, and a lot of it is like improv'd. But this is one of our on paper moments as an audio team, which is like fleshing out this thing on paper in the tone of what you think the piece is. So you're like, okay, the story starts, Lulu and Molly get into the studio and then they make a joke about Webster. Like, this is a story I'm working on now, which has like 3 Websters in it. So it's like this is like, and then you go, okay, we're going back to 1996 and like this thing happened and I first ran, and so you kind of like plot out what the story is. And then you share that around with like a team, your editor, maybe another editor, and everyone gives feedback. And then from there, like, maybe I need to do more reporting, I'm not really sure. And then at some point around there, either before or after the storyboard, we do something called what we call a brain dump. Berkuti went through many, many, many of these for hours with me, which is you just report back to someone about it's generally the hosts or like the lead reporter that you're working with. You report back about the reporting and the interviews you've done in the field or the interviews you've done from your closet or the studio or whatever. And so you just say like, oh my gosh. So, Berkuti for Birth Story, we would get on Skype and then she'd be like, okay, I spent all day walking around Kathmandu trying to find these surrogacy houses and I couldn't get into any of them. I called these things and then we ran out of gas and then like the internet broke. And so she would just literally tell me about her days. And then we'd connect 2 days later and she was like, okay, I think I have a lead on this house. And then eventually she spoke to surrogates and then she came back and then told me about all those interviews and also not just told me about the interviews, but told me what the experience was like. Who was in the room? What did it feel like to sit in the room? Did it seem open? Did it seem uncomfortable? What did things look like? So she's like painting a picture and telling me the content of the interviews. And so that's called the brain dump. And we use the brain dump to start creating the narration in the piece. So the way the audio piece works is you have tape, which is the stuff that you've gotten from your interview subjects, from doing interviews, from standing out next to that stream, from going into the surrogacy house, from talking to Berkuti and getting tape from her. And then you have the narration, which is like the weaving that you do to tell the story and put it all together. And I keep doing this because I always think of the brain dump or the narration is laying on top of the chunks of audio that are underneath. And they're kind of like, they dip down, they grab some audio, then you talk about the audio, then you dip down, you grab some audio, and they all kind of create like a layer cake and they're strung together. And so then you just begin a really iterative process of this. You try and take the storyboard and make it into audio piece. And then the audio will take control and change your storyboard entirely because you'll hear something in tape and you'll realize this is the other thing that happens in audio. Someone may say something, but like if they say it and it sounds like a question and you need it to sound like a statement, You can't get them to re-say it. So you're left with like, what do I do with that? Whereas like if I was in print, I would just take the quote and use it. It doesn't matter how they sounded when they said it. So there are so many moments when we start building an audio piece when you're like, oh, I've got the perfect line that's going to finish off this one section or really add something. And then you hear the tape of that line and you realize like a horn honked in the background, or they said it with this intonation, or you laughed and you can't cut it out. Like something happened. Yeah. And so then you are like, God, I work in audio. How do I make this work? And so you just do this really iterative process of cutting tape. It's, called cutting tape, but you're just like in your Pro Tools or your Audacity or your GarageBand or whatever you use, and you're into your WAV files and you're chopping them up into little sections, and then you're narrating over the top and you're weaving it all together, maybe adding some sound, which I always put in at the bottom. So that's like the bottom of my cake. I'm also not an amazing sound expert. So there's an amazing bunch of sound experts on our team who really know how to either make music or think about little boops and bops and those electrical firing signals, and they really round out things. And so then you just start doing draft. A big part of our process is fact checking.
Yeah.
So like, just because an expert said something doesn't mean they maybe could have misspoken, or maybe the data has changed since they told you about it. And so we have the luxury of actually working with an individual fact checker for every episode, where they literally go through, we make a paper transcript of the whole episode as we get closer to publish. And they literally go through, and everything that appears to be a fact, this person is friends with this person. This thing happened in 1996. This was published in Nature. There were 7 other things that were published. Anything that looks like a fact, they go through and they try and find original source material for, or they will interview very quickly a bunch of other people to like confirm that fact. Yeah. And then we publish. That's it. Come up with a title, write some web copy, get a really cool illustration. Like your very awesome illo for this conference, for this festival. Dare I call it a conference? It is a festival. And then you publish. No, it's a festival. And then you publish. So that was long, but I hope those steps are useful. Yeah. I hope the longness in that sense was okay.
No, absolutely. So we have one comment from one of our attendees, Molly Webster. He's actually a guest speaker as well. He says, Return of the Alpha Gal was awesome. I listened to that show 3 times.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, but we do have a question from the audience.
I mean, I guess the first question is, if it's a boring study, why are you going to talk about it? So a lot of things are boring, but if you're going to them for something, you're going to them for something. So what is the something? Is it boring, but it matters to humanity? Is it boring, but there's a funny twist? Is it boring, but like there has to be a reason you're going after the boring? Is it because it sits inside of something larger? Is it because it's a new piece of information that might appear boring, but it's not? You've got to convince us that. And so I think I would think, why am I going to this boring thing in the first place? Then once you have that, that's super important. And then you think, you hold on to that for dear life. And then you can talk to the scientists. Say if you're going to study economics, it doesn't all need to be science. Like it can be a lawyerly thing. It can be a court briefing. It can be, and it appears boring, but you know why it's not boring. So then you go to the people you're interviewing and you almost say like, anyone from the outside is going to think this is boring, but but we know it's not. Like I'm coming to you because it's not boring. So I need you to tell me why it's not boring. Like, even though I know, like I need you to break it down for the listener as to why this isn't boring, why this is exciting, why we should all be talking about this thing you did. And then, so that's one element. way of doing it. The other thing is like looking for the story, that beginning, middle, and end in that boring thing. Is it the way that boring thing was discovered? It looks boring, but there was like an interesting prequel. Is it how that links up with something else? There's an interesting sequel. Is it the person who wrote that boring thing is actually super fascinating and they have a story? So you're out there like, you know why it's not boring. Then you need to figure out how to communicate that to people. And if you do just keep thinking it's boring, then I would probably say don't do it. Pretty early. I don't know if I would say it comes in as fast as the pitch, because it's so dependent on people's voices and what you find. I mean, sometimes I might have an idea when I'm pitching where I'm like, oh, that scene could be really coolly made into something. You know, like right now I'm working on a story and we are just starting to build it, but I have known that we're going to do it for a few months, and I have been talking about it. Like the first part, you could almost think about the story in two parts. The first part's going to be a little faster, and like it's going to have like, you know, music is going to pop up, and there's going to be, I don't know what that music is, but I just have a sense of like the tenor. And then the back half is going to be a little more open space. It's going to be conversational. Maybe there won't be any like sound design. Maybe the music will be really subtle and just kind of like open and airy. So I have some of those basic gestural things, and we haven't started building yet. Building being starting to cut the audio and weave it together. That's actually starting today. And so I think, you know, we usually do at least one draft of the story that's called a string out. That's bare of anything. It doesn't have much narration in it. It just takes the audio that you've collected and it chops it up and puts it into the order of the storyboard, so you can just hear how it all lays out together and like how tape is playing off of each other. And you start getting a sense of like, ooh, this part's too long, this part wants to be shorter. And you just hear it really without music, without sound design, which is like kind of, you know, could be whatever that means to you, without fake narration over the top, like linking things together. You're just hearing tape laid out. And then generally we do that like 1 or 2 rounds. And then really you start to incorporate sound, because sound is really, you know, another thing about audio that's really different from print is rhythm. You know, there's a musicality to it. Like if you really think about listening to people's voices, there's like cadence and balance and rhythm and movement and pauses and silence and blah, blah, blah. And sometimes it's really fast. I get really excited. I talk fast. And then other times I'm like, I'm thinking, I've got to think it through. I've got, you know, and then there's like a lot of space and it gets quieter. And so that you are recreating that, not just through the interviews that you do, but through the pace of your story. And so this atmospheric sound, whether that's music or sound design or scene tape of that river, that all affects the rhythm. And so you do really want to start thinking about that early. And I'm like not one of the people on the team that composes music. Many of the producers and reporters do. But that doesn't mean that I can't take some like crappy music from like or great music from like a free share website and just put that in to gesture at like what I'm hoping to do, and hear how it's affecting the rhythm and the spacing. You know, Birth Story was really one of the biggest projects Radiolab had taken on as a singular episode. It took place in America, Israel, Nepal, India. And then we were also doing reporting in like the Ukraine and UK and Poland and just like all these places, really trying to understand global surrogacy. So that one actually I don't actually remember the month it was published in, but I feel like maybe it was like November.
Yeah, November, I think.
It was November. Okay, great. So that one I started working full time on in the 1st of September. And then I really worked far too much. But it was so worth it because it was like we were about to tell the story of these surrogate women. You just never hear their stories told. So that took an incredible amount of time, but it was 4 months. And that was the only project I was working on at that time. Now, thankfully, I work in a larger team, so other people could produce the bi-weekly episodes we needed to get out. So really, I think if you're doing audio, changing up your timeline is helpful if you're trying to meet a regular publication schedule, which is some are shorter, less investigative, maybe only is an interview with one person. Some are longer, more investigative. If you're really going for like, I'm doing investigative journalism and I'm going to interview tons of people for every episode, I think for that, you're really going to want some sort of funding and just like making sure that someone's committed to helping you get those, say, 6 episodes out. Episodes can really vary. I've done episodes I've done COVID episodes in a week. A lot of those were just like 1 or 2 conversations, and then we matched together audio and put it out. But there were like really late nights involved in getting that done. For the special series I did on sex development, which is called Gonads, I wasn't on air for 9 months, and I was like reporting all these stories and building them. And then we put out 6 stories and we did 2 live events in New York City. So I went from not being on air for 9 months to then being on air. I was the only one on air for 2 months. And then everyone else got to like rest a little. And so I guess it really varies. But I would say maybe an average of like, let's just say like a normal Radiolab story, not a birth story, not a special series. Like last summer I did an episode on why females get autoimmune disorders more than men. And so that came out in August. And, it's like I had done 2 interviews. I was thinking about the topic. I'd done 2 interviews like pre the pandemic, and then wasn't quite sure what to do with them, had used them for a couple of other things, but still hadn't like really done the why females get autoimmune disorders more. So I did these 2 interviews before the pandemic. We sat with the tape for a while. I did a bunch of other stories in the meantime. And then post a crazy COVID moment when I had a little more space to breathe, turned back to the story, did 1 or 2 more interviews, and then built the story. And so like maybe that was 2 months between like actually getting back into it and then publishing it. But at the same time, I was actually working on a couple of other things for the show at the same time. So it varies. I mean, I definitely say I know we have the luxury of time in a way other shows don't. And I'm really honored to have that because it is important to me but I have also worked in like daily news and weekly news or weekly podcasts. And then a lot of spreadsheets where I'll put in like, this is the person I talked to. This is when I talked to, I have a lot of documents. So it's like, this is the person I talked to. This is when I talked to them. This is like my favorite thing that they said, or my favorite bits of things, or I don't think we should use them. And maybe a link to and maybe a file path to where that audio lives. Because I feel like people are constantly like, what folder is it in? Like, blah, blah, blah,
That's us.
Yeah.
That's us.
Yeah, we've recently started using Dropbox in a way because you can like link and share without actually having to physically share files. And that's been incredibly helpful because you just can say, okay, all of the stuff for the autoimmune show lives in this folder, just like at least, and then everyone's linked to that folder and then they can access it through the cloud. And that's way better than the system we were at before. And then I also have I usually have a document when I'm doing reporting, early reporting, that I call like a précis or like a summary. And it's just like a 2-pager where I'll, so whenever I first start like reporting a story, my first step is just like researching it for 24 hours, basically, just like going on the internet, just reading about it, right? So if I'm going to do something about why women get autoimmune disorders more, or why autoimmune disorders disappear during pregnancy, which is like part of that story, that some can really go away during pregnancy and why, I just will read and just like kind of start letting information wash over me. But I don't want to like lose the stuff that I'm reading. And also while I'm reading, I'm getting ideas of like, who are major players in the field? What is a character? Is there a female with an autoimmune disorder that I should go to talk to, who's not a scientist or has an idea beyond just the science? And so I have this like summary document where I just will copy and paste facts that are interesting, or I use it to live stream like questions in my mind as they come up. So I'll just, because I don't want to lose the questions, and so I'll just have this doc, and every time I think of a question, I just dump it in there. It's kind of open on my screen next to the research I'm doing. And and it's a pretty ugly doc. It's like, I don't care what the font is, things copy and paste in different ways. But it's just like, there's usually a facts section, just like, 90% of women, 75% of women get MS, or 75% of MS patients are women, or something. And you should fact check that, because I don't know if that's right. But so like, I'll put like a facts thing, and then I'll put a list of people that I think is interesting. And then once I start reaching out to people, I'll note next to their name, like, did I reach out to them? What was the date I reached out to them? Did I do a pre-phone call with them where I just got them on the phone to just hear what they sounded like and see what they had to contribute? And so I'll just kind of make notes, and eventually I leave that document behind, but it stands there. And when a fact checker comes, or if later I'm like, what was I thinking way back at the beginning? I have that document to go back to, and to like remind myself of some of the facts I bumped across, to remind myself of some of the articles or URLs, like things I read, the book, book titles or whatever. To remind myself of people I reached out to but didn't end up using, or didn't ever respond to me.
So we have some commonalities with Radiolab.
Yeah, you have many, I'm sure.
Only the lack of organization.
Yeah.
Well, we are also very unorganized. So like, don't, and we're trying.
Like, that was so helpful, like to us, like to Prikuti and I also, and I'm sure like everyone who joined this session today. It was like a Radiolab episode. Like, you broke everything down, and there's so much that we can learn from the process that you have in place, the way you work as a journalist, the way you approach stories. I mean, that was really amazing, and we will definitely try and use a lot of the things that Molly shared with us today.
This is so one way. I'm excited for one day you to tell me all of your amazing Boju Bajai things. So
we can't wait.
And yeah, thank you again, Molly. We've loved having you, and we loved talking to you today. It was so much fun.
This is really great. I can't wait to look at your schedule and see what else you got going on.
Yes, please do. And thank you everyone for joining. And
thank you,
Molly. I've already said this so many times. I was just like squealing with joy when Molly confirmed. I was like, I just like woke up in the morning. I was like, oh my God, this is happening.
You did some of the most like kick-ass reporting. Like, we were very lucky to be synced up with you. Like, honestly, you live in infamy at the show, because everyone was very impressed.
Yay!
Not that we need to be impressed, but we were like really like, wow, this person's amazing. Can she come work with us again? So yeah.
That would be amazing.
Yeah, I hope we'll be able to do that soon. But yeah, we won't take much of your time. You already have another meeting lined up, so we'll let you have your breakfast at peace. Thank you so much, Molly. And thank you.
Good luck, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much.